Welcome to this new series of 3 episodes tackling the crisis of low-income families and unaffordable housing, brought to you by Taxpayers Against Poverty, which campaigns on behalf of low-income families. I'm Tom Burgess, and I'll be talking to the frontline campaigner, the Rev Paul Nicolson, founder of Taxpayers Against Poverty, and who was the architect of the original minimum income standards, which then became the real living wage. He has relentlessly campaigned and cared for those on low incomes for most of his 87 years, with both humour and determination, and he also knows what needs to be done. This is his story. And this first episode we'll be looking at the principles behind good policy making and how the Vicar of Dibley led to the first research into a living wage, and then how Paul came to set up Taxpayers Against Poverty. In episode 2, we'll look at both how the poll tax and then the council tax really made life difficult for many families in rented accommodation, and then exactly how much is enough to provide for a decent but basic standard of living. And in our final episode in this series, and there will be more coming from Taxpayers Against Poverty, Paul talks about how this unnecessary suffering by millions every day could have been avoided if we'd had the political will. Then, with the courage and compassion, we could ensure that adequate minimum incomes and truly affordable housing for all our people, that's our fellow citizens. Surely we share a moral responsibility to ensure that everyone in our country has a decent standard of living. And of course, last by no means least, we want to look at how we can resolve this man-made tragedy. If we can save the banks, we can save the homeless. So I started off by asking Paul about the principles behind good policy making.
There are four ethical principles, really assuming that it would be best from everybody's point of view if the benefit system was based on ethical principles. It starts off with the most fundamental, which is justice. We would suggest, and indeed it was suggested by Professor Peter Ambrose back in 2005 in a document called Z2K Memorandum to the Prime Minister in Unaffordable Housing. He said, "Land is the gift of a generous and loving God, intended for the provision of shelter, food, water, fuel, clothes for all." Or if you prefer it, and why not, and I would be perfectly happy supporting that, if you're a humanist, land is a gift of nature for the same purposes. So there's a second principle, which is a wonderful one. It's called the Golden Rule. It appears in all the holy books of all the major faiths. When the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Cardinal Hume, it was Robert Runcie and Cardinal Hume, went to pray for peace in Assisi in 1986, they came back and wrote a wonderful book of prayers which every faith can say, and indeed they make good reading from even people who are not faith. They set out life as it should be lived. And of course the fundamental point is they had a whole page of 11 different faiths, and in each of the faiths, each of the holy books, there was love your neighbour as yourself. The Golden Rule is absolutely at the heart of all major faiths.
So give us an example of some of the prayers.
For example, Hinduism. This is the sum of true righteousness. Do nothing to your neighbour which you would not have him do to you after. Or Zoroastrianism, that nature only is good when it shall not do to another whatever is not good for its own self. Or to take the Christian one, whatever you wish that men would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. They're all of the same ilk. They're actually commandments in the Christian faith, and we actually ought to be doing them every day, and it is a very heavy reminder for us that is something we have to do. Then the third principle would be peace. And I find this so utterly relevant to today, when we've got so much conflict and so much difference. Peace, said Albert Einstein, is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice, of law, of order, in short, of government. And then Martin Luther King, true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice. And a wonderful, totally comprehensive statement by a real statesman, Nelson Mandela. Peace is not just the absence of conflict. Peace is the creation of an environment where all can flourish regardless of race, colour, creed, religion, gender, class, caste, or any other social markers of difference. That is a very especially wonderful statement. And the fourth principle was set up by people who had been totally shocked by the depth of horror of the Second World War, which I'm just old enough to have remembered. And I was 16 when I went into a new cinema in Piccadilly and saw them reporting the liberation of Belsen concentration camp. The sight really remained with me for the rest of my life. It was totally horrifying. And what they did in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which came straight after that dreadful war, in 1948, Article 25 talks to the right to an adequate standard of living. And everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. And there's a special paragraph for motherhood and childhood, and quite right too.
So are you saying that these four principles are the basis for policy making?
I think, yes, that's exactly right. They ought to be in the mind of every member of Parliament, of all parties. You can have disagreements on party lines as to how to implement them, of course. It's not as if we're telling people how to do it. We're saying, here are the principles, and base your policies on these principles, please. Yes, it's no good having a principle, indeed, unless you actually put them into practice. A lot of what I am doing every day is about trying to put those principles into practice in the recommendations that we make to local and national government.
So you had a couple of stories.
Yes, two stories which I think alert people to the extraordinary relevance of the sayings of Jesus today. Those stories are written up in the Bible, and they ring a huge bell today. The first is the story of the workers in the vineyard. And if anybody wants the reference, it's Matthew 21 to 16, chapter 21 to 16. These two stories are totally relevant to today, even though they were told over 2,000 years ago. And of course, based on a philosophy which is long older than that. What we have is the story being told about a landowner, and the landowner employs people to work on his land, and they turn up at the gate of his property all through the day, and whenever they turn up, he takes them in and says, I'll pay you a denarius for the day's work. At the end of the day, they all form up for their pay, and they all get that denarius, and of course, this is not a story about a fair pay structure, and it's not surprising that there was a great complaint from the people who'd been there all day in the heat of the sun, and the people who turned up at the last hour or two got the same pay as them. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is that land exists for the benefit of everybody. Everybody should get a fair share of what the land produces. It's again back to the principle that we were talking about, the first principle, which is that land exists to provide shelter, food, fuel, clothes for all, and no one should be left without. And that is the point of that story. But then the story moves into another chapter a bit later in the Bible, but it's entirely relevant. This is Matthew 21, 33 to 46. Where the landowner goes away and lets out the land to a leaseholder. The leaseholders want it all for themselves. They're not going to share a single bit of the value of the produce of that property. And so the landowner sends along his servants to collect the rent, in a way, the share of the property that he owns. And they refuse to give it to the servant, and the servant is beaten up. And he sends more, and the servants are all beaten up. And so he says, okay, I'll send my son along. They're bound to respect him. And he is killed. And of course, it's a wonderful example of the abuse of power that land creates among so many of landlords and landowners today. There are very many tenants suffering evictions because they're not getting a fair share of land, which is really the property of everybody. It's only in kind of being let out by what we would say let out by God, let out by nature to everyone. Everyone has to have their fair share, and it's an abuse of power to keep it all for yourself.
Tell us about the Vicar of Dibley, how that came to happen.
I was the vicar of the church in which sitcom was filmed. As would happen with these things, a man arrives and knocks on the door and said, "May we use your church to make a film?" And so I said, "Well, come in and sit down." After we talked for a bit, I said, "Look, get them to send me a script, and when I've read the script, I will decide." And it was right in the middle of the hottest debate in the Church of England about the ordination of women. And when I read it, I thought, well, we just got to do this. But the last thing to do is to ask the bishop. He wouldn't want to be asked, I was quite certain. So when he came back, I was able to tell him we had the most enormously difficult problem because we just had a film in the village and they built a extra bit onto the pub and created a war scene in the middle of the night when it was dark. And they bombed it, but they hadn't warned anybody. I mean, they made noises like bombs. They hadn't warned anybody in the village that they were going to bomb the village. And so people were coming out in that night dress and saying, "What on earth's going on?" And I was going around the village saying they got this rather interesting film, and they were saying, no, Paul, never again. We're never going to have another film. They'll only bomb us, and it's just a frightful nuisance. So when the man came again, I said, "Look, I do want to do it, but we do have the dreadful problem. The village won't take another film. How much are you going to pay?" We agreed on 5,000 for the church. And then I said, "Look, we got 35 houses. It's a relatively small village, typical small, beautiful Chiltern village." And I said, "If you can manage £500 a house, I think we might be all right." So he said, yes, they could do that. And I was going around the village saying, "Look, we got this film to do." And they would say, no, Paul, we can't do that. And I'd say, "Well, we're all going to be paid £500 a house and 5,000 for the church." And it eventually went through the Parental Church Council without touching the sides. And so we did the Vicar of Dibley in our church. And they were very sweet. They were wonderful in terms of dealing with all of us locally. They took a busload up to the studio, and it was altogether a very successful exercise from everybody's point of view. So that's how we got the Vicar of Dibley.
So just tell us about Taxpayers Against Poverty and what you're trying to do there.
I'm constantly driven by a faith which requires us to put into practice the principles we hold. And so if we hold that the poor must be put first, or people on low incomes and in unaffordable housing must be put first, we then have to take action in order to see what we can do to get them out of the difficulties they're currently in, the poverty they're currently in, the homelessness they're currently in. And that's what really urged me on to found Taxpayers 2000 Trust, because I started working with, as a parish priest, I started working and going to court with people who could not pay the poll tax, were in dreadful debt and going hungry. We set up a fund there which would also give them £50 when they were completely skinned. So I went to court, and eventually the first thing that Taxpayers 2000 Trust did was to get a contract with Wycombe Magistrates Court to work with people who could not pay their fine and to provide the magistrates with a mean statement so the magistrates could decide whether or not they could let them off the fine or part of the fine because they were too poor to pay it. And what would normally happen is they'd never be in court when they were fined, so they get a huge fine. I would go into the court and say these people were not in the court when they were fined. Here are the facts, and the magistrates would remit the fine, or part of it. And that really taught me the lesson that I needed to know, and on those grounds I founded the Taxpayers 2000 Trust to fund that kind of activity. To cut a long story short, I took my pension in 1999 because the Taxpayers were taking me over and I couldn't be a parish priest any longer and run the Taxpayers. It was also to use the evidence and the facts and the circumstances of people suffering as a means of changing the law to make life better, to get the structures right, so that doesn't happen anymore. It's the structures which are upsetting the families so very badly. So I did all that, and it gradually built. I left it in 2012 with a wonderful chief executive, with something like 10 staff and volunteers, and they're now doing in the region of 2,000 cases for about 1,200 people, because each person normally has counter-tax, rent and various other disability problems, and so there's more than one fine, one debt, one problem to be dealt with. But it's about 2,000 cases a year in London, mostly in Westminster. However, I got fed up with the Charity Commission saying that charities may not be political or make political statements opposing particular political parties, which of course is an absurd position to be in. If the one thing you know about is the circumstances are the very poorest, and you know either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party or the Lib Dems and the Conservative Party, which is what happened, are making it worse. So you have to go along and say publicly the Labour Party must change its policy, which we did here with the council tax, and which we did throughout the Labour time the Labour Party was in power. And we've been doing it ever since now. I've been doing it ever since now, but we have to be very careful if you're a charity as to how you do it. I don't want to be careful. I want to state the facts as they are. That's what we do with Taxpayers Against Poverty. I'm effectively executive, and we have a very, very good board of people who really understand what the issues are. And we put this information down the line on Twitter, on Facebook, on email, and on our website. We run seminars in the House of Commons with the support of members of Parliament, which get the facts on record with wonderful support from academics. So we've had a seminar on the impact of poverty on health, a seminar on unaffordable housing and why and how it happens and how it might be put better, a seminar on the moral case for a better benefit system, a seminar on which was also about the land value tax, which is a very foul way of distributing the unearned and untaxed increase in the value of land, which goes meanwhile only to landowners, but the tenants get none of that now, and they pay taxes. But the people who get unearned, untaxed land value increases are unfairly taking what should be shared with everybody. We've now got 22,000 followers on Facebook. We're rising 3,000 followers on Twitter. We have email addresses of over 1,000, and one of the best resource pages on the website of anyone in the country. It is quite brilliantly put together by academics who've been kind enough to help us. So that's where we are now. We do what we can on the ground. We campaign for better policies, and we put it all out on social media.
For more volunteers and support, and indeed finance.
We need more money, and we simply put it out on social media that you can donate to us this way. And we have a law. One of our rules is that you can be a member without paying anything, because we want people who can't afford to pay to be part of us and not to be excluded. We've got donations from £200 a month to £2 a month being made, and it gives us an annual income of around £7,000 or £8,000 a year, simply by voluntary donations, and that's for which we are immensely grateful, and a very, very pleasant way of doing it, because we can tell the world we are only funded by our supporters and not by anyone else.
Thanks very much for that fascinating overview, Paul. There is indeed some remarkable work going on. So what do you think? To find out more, please go to our website. That's taxpayersagainstpoverty.org.uk, where you can contact us if you would like to comment, donate, or get involved. We'd like you to do all those three things. All our funds come from individual contributions. Thank you very much. Please help on a number of fronts. We're looking to build a volunteer network too. Coming soon in the next episode, we'll look at how the poll tax and then the council tax really made life difficult for many families in rented accommodation, and then exactly how much is enough to provide a decent but basic standard of living. So thank you for listening. I'm Tom Burgess on behalf of Taxpayers Against Poverty. Now, this podcast is a partner with the Real Agenda network of podcasts for political change. You can find out more at realagenda.org.